Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Today we have a very special, what I would call a premiere episode with Roy Riachi. We're talking about Riachi, well, really winery first and distillery now from Lebanon. And I, once again, am kind of speechless to talk to you of brand new distillery for all intents and purposes. So Roy, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
And so for a little background on just how this came to be, I received an invite to come to one of the big liquor shops in New York, Park Avenue Liquor Store. A lot of brands have been launched there over the years, from Compass Box to I mean several others. But you guys got to launch Levant Heights, Athyr, uh, at Park
Levant
Avenue.
Heights and Athyr there, yes.
Yes, and you got to do that. Brandy Library, also in New York, and of course Travel Bar, my favorite in the city, besides a couple other cities in the U.S. And I happened to go, got to meet you, got to meet the representative from Allied, Ed, and tried the whiskeys and just said, I gotta talk to this guy more. I gotta know more about this process. What's going on? It's the only Lebanese whiskey distillery there. I gotta talk more. So thankfully, that is the background. That covers the background. So let's just jump right in. You're back in Lebanon now, so
Yep,
we are about 7 hours apart, but we're gonna have a
exactly.
good time on this one. So let's just dive right in with the history of Riachi, and let's say up until you started distilling.
Okay. We've been distilling since the beginning, but we've
Oh,
started with the whiskey about 11 years ago. So let me just give a brief introduction about Riachi. So I'm Roy Riachi, the eighth generation winemaker and master distiller at Riachi. We are based in Mount Lebanon, about 35, 40 minutes away from the capital city, Beirut. And we're in the mountains. So we're at an altitude of 1,150 meters above sea level, which equates to around 3,500 feet above sea level. So regarding the history of the winery, it basically we've been doing wines and arak, which is the Lebanese spirit, since we started. So we've been distilling spirits for almost 184 years, if not more. Whiskey, on the other hand, we started fairly recently, and the main inspiration behind it was honestly the setup that we already had. So our portfolio doesn't only cover wines and spirits, but we also do liqueurs. So we have some jacketed tanks that we were able to modify to double as a mash tun, and the fermenters are there. The still actually is quite interesting. So I would say maybe 50 or 60 years ago, my grandfather, George, decided to basically upgrade the still. So we had a smaller still. I think, if I'm not mistaken, was about 800-liter boiler. So he wanted to upsize it. So he actually bought a copper pot still from Armagnac in France, which had around 1,800-liter boiler, so which was much larger. But its design isn't the typical Armagnac still, because most Armagnac stills have, uh, you know, uh, plates in their columns. So they have some plates in the column. This is an empty column, so it's a boiler with an empty column. It resembles the Scottish gooseneck still quite a bit, but unlike the Scotch still, it does not have an onion in the column. So it has a fairly cylindrical shaped column, and then its condenser is a worm tub with a very long worm. Basically, it spans around 47 meters, which is roughly almost 150 feet. So there's a lot of copper contact. So We were using this still mainly to distill brandy and to distill arak. So I thought that it might be interesting since we already have some of the shared setup to start experimenting with whiskey as well. So that's why we got into whiskey. But as in distillation, we've been doing that for a very long time. And honestly, the history of distilled spirits is, you know, quite broad, and not a lot of people have delved into it. I understand why, because it's a bit confusing. There's a lot of narratives, there's a lot of uh, marketing that plays into the history of distilled spirits in general. But all distilled spirits, in one way or another, are rooted in basically some of the same terminologies, and they have a shared history when it comes to the origin story, if you want.
Absolutely. And the it's funny that you say that the still kind of it was gotten from an Armagnac producer, but even then it's not the typical Armagnac still. It's still a little bit different on that. And 150-foot long worm tub, 47 meters. That's a lot of copper contact, which
Yeah.
is great for I mean for
Yep.
spirits in general, but especially for whiskey. That's great. And so if you're the family is distilling across 8 generations, 100 almost a
184 years.
184 years, yeah. And so you said that part of the reason you got into whiskey was because you had the setup already. In a way, you modified a few elements of the process, but you had the general setup available. Looking back 11 years or so when you started, or even a little bit longer than that, maybe, when you're thinking about it, was there something either happening in Lebanon, in the area, in the world even, that made you say that this foray into whiskey was worth it?
Okay. So Lebanon in general is a spirits culture. So we produce and consume a lot of spirits. And as I mentioned earlier, the main national spirit is arak, which is an anise-based spirit where basically you ferment wine, you double distill it, and on the third distillation run, you put green Levantine anise seeds in the still and distill it for a third run. And usually this is consumed like an as an aperitif, so it's consumed with food. So how we consume it is usually we mix 1 part of arak with 2 parts water, and it's consumed with Lebanese food. So almost, and it's not. So basically, uh, we don't only have a very big industry of arak production. Actually, a huge chunk of the consumed arak in Lebanon is homemade. So you have a lot of home distilleries as well in Lebanon. So we have the Lebanese culture is known for having a lot of home distillation and also consuming of arak, but also the second best selling spirit aside from arak in Lebanon, actually the best selling spirit is whiskey, because arak is produced by most people. So even though arak might not sell as much as whiskey, it's probably consumed more than whiskey, but it's
Gotcha.
distilled more than whiskey, because there's a lot of home distillers.
Right, right. And so
So,
is
yeah.
no, please.
So the culture is there here, and but like most countries, the evolution starts when it comes to classical whiskey consumption outside of the U.S. It's mainly in blended Scotch whiskey, because in the U.S. it's one of the 4 main whiskey producing countries. You have your own whiskey styles. Bourbon is a huge part of American whiskey culture. In Lebanon, the main whiskey that was consumed and still is blended Scotch whiskey. But late 90s, early 2000s, we saw basically the uh, the rise of single malt Scotch in the industry, and it was gaining momentum slowly. It still didn't. Uh, quantify more than, let's say, maybe I would say, I don't know, 3 to 5% of the total whiskey consumption in Lebanon. But it was gaining in popularity. It rose from 0 to 3% in a few years. And it was, I think, between 2010 and 2019, it grew by another 3%, 3 to 4%. So it doubled in a span of 10 years in terms of volume. But in terms of value, it had a greater chunk because, most single malt Scotch is higher, fetches a higher price versus blended Scotch whiskey. So as a market, it was a growing market in Lebanon and worldwide. It was growing as well. Also, world whiskies were basically a growing segment, especially with Japanese whiskies and Japanese single malts. So I felt that there was an opportunity with brown spirits, especially while having the wine industry very saturated. Competition in wine is actually more cutthroat than in whiskey.
I can believe it. There there are a surprising number of people who work in the whiskey industry, whether it be on the production side, the marketing side, what have you, that I've spoken to or even had on the podcast that come from the wine industry and then move into whiskey industry. And a lot of them say that they end up having more fun in the whiskey industry because it's more collaborative, and yeah, there's competition, of course, but there's it's less cutthroat for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
100%. Now, both are fairly, you do have your pretentious elements in both industries. So you will get pretentious characters and pretentious brands with wine and with whiskey as well. But that's not a big deal. Even consumers, you do get some pretentious consumers on both the ends. But that's fine. That's part of any industry basically. So that's fine. And also, for some reason, got into whiskeys. I would say late, like probably in '08. I didn't really like whiskey all that much when I started. So my taste usually was more towards arak and wines. But I started developing a taste, especially when I started getting into single malt Scotch by 2008, 2009, 2010. So, and I started collecting those different brands. And the main inspiration, honestly, was when I saw the great resemblance between the still that we are using and the Scottish pot still.
And can you do you mind telling us what your favorites were at that time?
Well, definitely, I would say the Dalmore back in the days was one of my favorites because it was fairly well balanced, easy to drink, so the peated varietals are always an acquired taste. So you will have to get into them. You can't really just taste it the first time and really like a Lafroig or an Ardbeg or whatever. It's an acquired taste because how our palate is structured in a way to be aversive to astringent and bitter flavors. So those are definitely an acquired taste. Uh, Definitely Glenfiddich is an entry-level whiskey because it's a nice, easy drinking space side. Also, it's on the lower end of the pricing structure. So when you're in your early 20s, it's one of the more accessible whiskeys for you and for most of the you know people that consume whiskey but don't consume single malt Scotch.
Sure.
What else? So the brands are quite diverse. So when I started reading more about uh, whiskey and whiskey production and whatnot, and I saw the still that they were using, I basically started uh, experimenting with the ideas first. And we also had basically from 2005 till 2015, for about 10 years, we had a company that produced alcopops and beers, which was a separate company, which was sold from Riachi. So the beer was already being produced. So you, I started experimenting with the pale malts, not the Lebanese barley first. Definitely not hopped. And I ran a few stripping runs. To this day, by the way, how we distill is basically through one still. We don't have two stills, a wash still and a spirit still. So we run several stripping runs, and then we combine those low wines into one spirit run. So from then on, after we started experimenting, we saw that this could work. I decided I wanted to produce a whiskey that reflected the terroir and the cuisine. Now I know the concept of terroir is very speculative, and they either like it or they hate it in the whiskey industry, mainly because how it's how it's pitched. But in order to have a terroir, you have to have some elements from the local landscape, from the not viticulture, from the agricultural output of a certain region, be reflected in the whiskey. So in that sense, it could work in whiskey. You'd need a unique barley. You need a unique grain that is unique to a specific terroir. And you also need a unique, the main flavoring agent in most whiskeys is the oak. So you need a unique oak that is unique to a particular terroir. So we decided to experiment with Lebanese barley. It's a two-row kind of barley, which is mostly used for semolina, which is a type of flour used mostly in baking. But this also renders the Lebanese barley fairly expensive when compared to other kinds of, let's say, barleys. It's almost the price I would say is almost slightly cheaper when you buy it raw as raw barley versus malted barley. But once you malt it, because you lose about 30% from the total volume when malting, so it becomes a bit more expensive than buying ready-made malts. And secondly, when it comes to the oak, especially now I'm talking about Athyr, our first whiskey that we launched, which is also our premium range. We wanted to use Lebanese oak. So Lebanese oak is actually a genus of its own. It's Quercus libani. But Lebanese oak and other forest trees in Lebanon are illegal to cut down. So you are not allowed to cut down forest trees in Lebanon. You're only allowed to cut down fruit-bearing trees because most fruit-bearing trees, they uproot them and replant others every 7 to 10 years. So it's legal to, let's say, cut down apples and pears and whatnot. But it's not legal to cut down oak and pine and cedar and stuff like that. But it is perfectly legal to prune. So what we do is that we prune the branches, we debark them, we toast them, and then we borrowed from the aging method of arak, which is clay amphoras. So we get the clay amphora, which is a porous vessel. and actually has a unique influence on the content. So we put the oak branches, the cured oak branches, inside of the clay amphora, and then put the whiskey with it. Now, as a vessel, it's quite unique because one, it's porous. Two, it can give an earthy character to the spirit. And thirdly, it has a relatively stable temperature. So even when you have temperature fluctuations in the environment, uh, it's still relatively cool. So let's say in winter, it might go down to about, I would say, 10 degrees Celsius, even if the environment was freezing around it at 0 Celsius, which is, so we'll do the conversions later
Sure,
in
sure,
Fahrenheit.
sure. At 10 degrees, we're
But in summer, it
Celsius,
doesn't go
it's about
beyond
about 50
20
or so.
Celsius.
Yeah.
So yeah, so if the environment was at 0 Celsius, it would mean that it's about 32 Fahrenheit. So if it's at 32 Fahrenheit, it would be probably at around 50 Fahrenheit, the content inside, if the ambient environment. And if it was quite warm around it, it would not, let's say if the weather was, I don't know, or the ambient temperature was around 80 or 82 Fahrenheit, the content would not be more than 20 degrees Celsius, which is about 72 maybe Fahrenheit. So it's the temperature fluctuation is fairly stable, mainly because the environment also is fairly stable around it, because we're a winery, so where we age our wines and spirits, they're in different locations, but the general atmosphere inside the winery is fairly cool year round. So basically, the temperature does not exceed, uh, on average, it's around 18 degrees Celsius. And on very cold winters, it can go down to around 10 Celsius. So it's a fairly cool environment inside the distillery.
So there's so many things to jump off of from there, and we'll definitely get to all of them. The first one being just a quick note that I saw on your website. This was specifically with the Athyr, but I'm guessing it applies to all spirits. Is that you're facing about a 1 to 2% angel share a year?
Yeah.
Which based on the climate you just described, that sounds exactly right. That very low angel share, constant temperature or stable temperature, I should say. And the idea to use the amphoras, I this is probably the question that I was most nervous to ask, because it's something obviously we don't really have here in the US. We don't use clay amphoras, and in terms of these products and getting into whiskey, did you or do you face any issues in terms of calling it whiskey, simply because it's not in an oak container per se, but rather in a clay amphora with oak in it, and then for one product also in cedar? So
Awesome. So thanks a lot for asking this question. And this is an awesome question to delve more into the history of whiskey in general and the definition in general. So I did get some backlash from very few really whiskey lovers, but in general, it's not the case. In any case, the backlash that I got when it comes to calling it whiskey was fairly minimal. Like they're still under 10 people, I might say, even under 5. And the main reason is, well, what is whiskey? So let's go into the etymology. and the definition. So, as I was mentioning earlier, I wanted to connect the history of distilled spirits with whiskey and why we got into it. So one of the reasons why was definitely commercial. So getting into whiskey made sense at the time, still does, but also culturally. As I mentioned, Lebanon is a spirits producing country, and it's part of its environment. The Levant has a very old history in distilled spirits. So by definition, the word whiskey comes from Gaelic and Celtic ishke baha. They're written with basically whiskey with a U. Ishke is written with a U, and baha is bitha, written as bitha. But this wording means water of life. So this wording means water of life. So whiskey is originally ishkebah. And the oldest reference for basically distilling or the oldest historical reference for whiskey was basically a king sending his men to buy malted barley malts to produce aquavita. Now, aquavita is water of life in Latin. But
Right.
why was aquavita the term that was used back in the day? Do you know?
I have definitely learned it, and it is blanking on me, but I think it's because it was safest to drink.
Okay, no problem. So the word alcohol comes from Arabic, from kuhul, which means, which also comes from another word in Arabic, which is kahl. Kahl basically is mascara. So when you're distilling in copper pot stills, a byproduct of distillation is silver in very low quantities, and that silver was used also for mascaras. Now, also in the Arab world, which basically was the pioneer in distilled spirits. The oldest alchemical references for distillation of wines in particular were in the Arab world. They date back to the 8th century AD. There was a polymath called Abu Jabir ibn Hayyan. If you Google the father of alchemy, this guy uh, is him, basically. So he was the first to document distillation, and also he was the first to draw the pot still in a fairly scientific manner. But also distillation in the Arab world predates that. So this was the first scientific reference for distillation. Prior to that, there's a lot of literary references in Lebanon or not only in Lebanon, in the Arab world in general for distillation. And actually, there's a whole segment of poetry in the Arab world called khamriyat, which basically are poems about drinking and getting drunk. So arak, for example, which in its current form is distilled with anise. Before that, it wasn't. So the oldest reference for arak being distilled with anise dates back to the 9th century. Now I know it feels like I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but there's so much going on here. So you will see how this is all related when I'm done.
I trust you.
It's a bit of a rabbit hole. So the oldest reference for arak being distilled with anise dates back to the 9th century, where a Persian polymath by the name of Al-Razi basically said that the countries of the Levant were distilling arak with aniseed. But arak by definition means sweat. So distillation is when your liquid is evaporating it passes through a condenser. And what's happening is that condensation is sweat. That's why it's called arak. The vapor is turning into liquid. So most brandies at the time were called arak in the Arab world, but they were also called khamr ma'alla, which is basically elevated wines, because when you distill, the vapor is rising. And also, the oldest literary reference for distilled spirits in the Arab world is ma al-hayat, which is water of life. And this dates back to around the 5th century. So the oldest reference in whiskey for aquavita is about probably the 14th century. The oldest reference for water of life in the Arab world dates back to the 5th century, where basically it was mentioned by several poets. The most notable was basically a poem about basically he was a figure in Arabic mythology. This guy was called Antar bin Shaddad, and he was supposedly addressing his soon-to-be father-in-law. He was telling him basically if he wants to offer him a drink, water of life. If you want, I'll mention it in Arabic and try to do the literal translation. So, Ma al-Hayat is water of life. Just for, I'll do it. I know that most of the audience won't understand what I'm saying, but in order to give it some context. So it goes like, لا تسقني ماء الحياة بذلة فإن كأس الحنظلة بالذلة كجهنم وجهنم بالعزة أطيب منزلا. So what he was trying to tell him is that don't offer me a drink if you want to humiliate me, because offering me a drink while humiliating me feels like hell. But if you were honoring me and I was going through hell, it would be even better than drinking the best water of life. Something like that. I know I butchered the translation, but that was the gist of it. So water of life is, as a term, predates aquavita by 1,000 years almost. And the guys that actually got distillation into Europe were the Arabs through two main routes. Because at the time, the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th century had very strong commercial relations with Salerno, which was an Italian city-state. And also Spain, a huge part of Spain was part of the Arabic Empire. So that's how water of life, Ma al-Hayat, got into most European countries. And Ma al-Hayat became aquavita, and aquavita was the main reference for distilled spirits. So there was no distinction between the different kinds of distilled spirits. They were either wines, ales, basically fermented liquids that are either from fruits or grains, and then you had distilled spirits, which were called aquavita. And aquavita actually evolved into several things in Europe with the passage of time. For example, in France, still to this day, they use the term eau de vie, which translates, basically it's water of life in French is eau de vie. They still use it for distilled spirits in general. And whether it was brandies or whatnot. But even cognac, for example, which is a brandy that is distilled in the town of Cognac, the oldest reference for it was eau de vie de Cognac, and it only became an appellation in 1936. The French AOC, which is the governing body for wines and spirits, decided to make it into an appellation in 1936, followed by Armagnac in 37 and Calvados in 38, if I'm not mistaken. However, Ishkebaha in Scotland became anglicized by an Englishman, not by a Scot. So
Sounds
there
about right.
was an English writer called Martin Martin in 1715 who went to Scotland and visited a couple of distilleries and uh, saw that they were drinking something called ishkebaha. And you can see how ishke can become anglicized into whiskey. So the first time whiskey was used was in 1715 by Martin Martin. But the first time, I think the Scotch Whisky Association used the term whiskey properly was in 1910. Now, the idea behind whiskey being aged in oak, necessarily in oak barrels to be called whiskey, is mostly a national narrative for Scotland. In general, if you want to think of it as a term, whiskey is a distilled spirit from grain versus brandy, which its origin is brandewijn, which means burnt wine in Dutch, which was also anglicized by the English into brandy, is a distilled spirit from wine. So I think the source matters most, and also in the U.S. you do have whiskeys that are not barrel aged. So as not so I know I went into a very deep rabbit hole. If I want to summarize, if it looks like a dog, it barks like a dog, then it's most likely a dog, you know? So if it looks like whiskey, smells like whiskey, tastes like whiskey, made from the same stuff, aged in the same stuff, then it's probably, you know, whiskey.
For sure. For sure.
Are you still
And
with me?
yep. Yeah. Yeah. And I really appreciate you going into that because there's you're right that the definition is that we think of in let's say the Western whiskey community is we think about it, it's got to be an oak. It's got to be an oak for 3 years if it's in Scotland or Ireland and um, Japan. But you're right that those are all kind of post ex post facto laws and regulations. It's not specific to the whiskey. So, and for what it's worth, too.
They're technically not laws in Scotland, by the way.
Oh, right,
They are
yeah. The SWA is not illegal. Yeah,
they're not mandated by the government. They
yeah,
are yes.
yeah,
So
yeah,
the SW is a co-op technically.
yeah, yeah. In
So
the U.S., it
it's
is
the
legal.
main narrative of the SWA.
Yeah,
So there is really yes, basically the TTB puts the regulations for whiskey. But for example, bourbon counts as a whiskey, doesn't it? You know that basically legally you can call something bourbon if it's aged in new charred American oak barrels even for 1 day.
mhm. Just has to touch wood.
But
Yeah,
yeah, it has to touch wood exactly. So straight bourbon is a different story. Straight bourbon has to be aged for at least 2 years, and you know the rest. The idea is that it's in a nutshell, in order not to go deeper into that rabbit hole, basically, if it's made from cereal grains, fermented and distilled, and then aged with wood, then it's whiskey. If its sugar source is made from something else, then it's gonna be either a rum or a brandy. But technically, those are the only three things that a brown spirit can be, to my knowledge.
that sounds about right. And before I, well, wait, let me see. There was one part that I wanted to jump back on for a second. It was, oh yes, it was just my own experience. It was that when I met you at Park Avenue and tried the whiskey. So at the time, I tried the two Levant Heights releases, the Athyr Spirit of Legends and the Athyr Cedarwood finish. Now,
Yes.
I looked up nothing about the brand before I came in. I wanted to go in with blind eyes and or open eyes, whichever way you want to put it, and just taste it for what it was. And finding out afterwards that it's amphora aged with the oak uh, in the amphora, and then the cedarwood being a little different just because you're doing the cedar for another year, you would never guess as a Western whiskey drinker, you would never guess that it wasn't aged in a barrel for all intents and purposes, and everything else that a barrel could mean. You know, for me, it tasted exact like you were saying with the dog analogy. It tasted like a whiskey, a unique one to be sure, but recognizably as a whiskey. So with that, I think it is worth noting that depending on where you're coming from, what you want to define as a whiskey is ultimately up to it's up to where you're coming from. And yeah, I would certainly call these whiskeys with no
And what
hesitation.
it's made
So,
from.
and what it's made from exactly. Um, within just a quick question on that, within Lebanon, you guys are the only distillery making single malt whiskey in Lebanon right now. Are there any uh, either laws or regulations that dictate to you that what whiskey can be or what another spirit can be?
So whiskey regulations in Lebanon mainly, I think, are set by the Ministry of Industry. And the main thing about whiskey is that it has to be grain based. So, but there are no, um, detailed regulations when it comes to whiskey in particular. There are some whiskey bottlers in Lebanon. Mostly they import like bulk Scotch whiskey and bottle it in Lebanon. And mainly for local consumption, they're for the mass markets, fairly cheap as well. The bottle prices on average range, if I told you the prices, they're crazy. It's between $3 and $5. So they're very
Jeez.
cheap whiskeys. But yes, basically there's a lot of there's a couple of whiskey bottlers in Lebanon, but as the whiskey distillery, we're the only whiskey distillery. If I When it comes to arak, on the other hand, regulations are a bit more strict and tight, so they do emphasize the source, where what kind of grapes it's made from. It has to be distilled in copper stills. You have to use green anise because arak, for example, like whiskey, can be tampered with. So, for example, Southern Comfort, which is a spirit whiskey, it's technically a fake whiskey or like a flavored vodka. We do have uh, this stuff also prevalent in the arak world, where you do have, for example, anise infused vodkas labeled as araks. Uh, Mainly, I think why the main focus would be on arak in Lebanon. One, because it's our national drink. Two, there's a lot of producers. And thirdly, there's not a lot of regulations when it comes to whiskey because there aren't that many producers. So we're the only producers that produce it from scratch, and there are a couple of other bottlers, and that's it.
So I want to ask a question now that is it could be a podcast onto itself. Um, but it's a generalization that I think we need to address head on, which is this notion, it's a Western notion to be sure, that that alcohol just doesn't exist, isn't enjoyed, isn't drunk in the Arab worlds, including everything from North Africa, Levant, up to Turkey, and going east from there. Now, clearly, that's not the case. There's plenty of wine all over that region.
I
National
think we
spirit,
covered that a bit when we were talking
yeah,
about the definition.
right? You've got I mean, Lebanon has a national spirit. You don't have a national spirit if the population doesn't drink. It just doesn't go together. Um, Granted, some countries in that region will be more strict about it. Some are very strict about it, adhering to the hadith. But um, I know I'm putting a lot on you to answer this for us, but what do you think, or how should we look at whether it's the Levant, North Africa, Turkey, Middle East, any of that, and say, no, there are spirits drunk. There's wine drunk there. It's not like you have an entire region of the world where alcohol is unknown. Is you know, and I know that's a big question, but
The I understand the question. So I think the main problem would be because currently the dominant religion of that area is Islam. And in Islam, drinking isn't really prohibited. So if you look at the Quran, for a lot of, I am not a Muslim, by the way, but
sure,
and in Lebanon, there's actually a lot of different religions. 40% of the population is Muslim, but the rest is 60% or a bit less is Christian, and there are other minorities, and also there is a bit of a tiny Jewish population as well in Lebanon. So there's a bit of everything. But in the Arab world, also it's quite mixed. And when I was talking about the Abbasid Caliphate, where alcohol was being documented, it was a caliphate. It was basically Islamic rule, but drinking was prevalent. So there is a common narrative and what actually happened. So I think in the Arab world, there are a couple of countries that are dry states like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. I'm not sure if there's any, maybe Libya in North Africa, but I think those are the only three dry states in the Arab world. The rest, so the Arab world is composed of around 22 different states. 3 of them are dry, the rest drink, And the history of wines and spirits, in one way or another, are rooted in that region because, the origin story of wine, which predates distilled spirits, goes back to the agricultural revolution, and that happened in Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq. So wine started from that region. It was actually exported westwards on the Mediterranean basin from Lebanon, because Lebanon is on the eastern side of the Mediterranean basin. It wasn't called Lebanon back then. It was basically there were city-states on the coast which had a common culture, basically stretching from southern Turkey down to northern Egypt. And those cultures were Canaanites and Phoenicians, which were known to be very good merchants and also shipbuilders. Mm-hmm. So almost 3,000 years ago, they exported viticulture westwards towards the North African coast and and the Southern European coast. And then, the Romans and the Greeks expanded viticulture. Distillation, on the other hand, there are some clay artifacts for distillation in ancient Egypt, but there's no conclusive evidence that they've distilled since then. But there is a lot of evidence for distillation in the Arab world. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there is a whole section of Arabic poetry about basically getting drunk and drinking. the most famous poet of which is called Abu Nawas. And it didn't cease to exist at any point in time. So drinking wines and spirits has been a common practice in the Arab world since its inception. I think the main idea that Muslims or Islam doesn't drink because it is frowned upon in the Quran, the Islamic holy book, but it's not prohibited because there are some passages that actually look at wine in positive light. But in general, like hardcore Islamic countries don't want to highlight the narrative where their population actually consumes alcohol. So I think that's the main reason why you have this perception that Arabs don't drink and don't produce any alcohol. Because the states, the more like Islamic and conservative states don't want this narrative to be associated with them. So that's why I think they've had this influence on the Western world where there's a dissociation between the Arab world and the alcohol. So the first would be definitely the main reason is religious, and secondly, it's basically politics.
I mean, it was worth asking just because, I mean, for many reasons, but also you're highlighting the multiculturalism that happens. To say that only 40%, only in quotation marks, 40% of the population in Lebanon is Muslim. That's a plurality. It's not even a majority. It's in what, if you're generalizing, you would say, oh, you expect a higher percentage, but particularly where you are and along the coast and from, as I think that's a great range, especially from, let's say, Turkey to Egypt, where it would have been Canaanite and Phoenician. The multiculturalism has always been there. And because of that, the idea of it as a monolithic culture where drinking just doesn't happen regardless of who you are is just not right. And the other thing I want to throw back to is a couple of months ago now, I had on Dr. Mark Schrod, and he was talking about his book on global prohibition. And there's an entire chapter devoted just to the Ottoman Empire for basically for that exact reason, to say that, everyone in the West would think that the Ottoman Empire must have been, prohibition before prohibition was cool kind of thing, no alcohol or anything. And he's like, no, that wasn't the case at all. There was plenty of alcohol consumed and made throughout the Ottoman Empire through its entire history, because it was so many cultures and so many traditions that it's conflating two things together that aren't together. So it was another question that I definitely
because we as human beings we like to stereotype. It's easier.
Of course.
And by the way, regarding the Ottoman Empire, so Lebanon was part of the Ottoman Empire, and up until I think 1920. So the modern state of Lebanon was formed in 1920. Prior to that, basically Lebanon was a governorate inside the Ottoman Empire, which lasted for more than 400 years. So how the Ottomans actually governed their lands was basically through decentralization. So it was even more decentralized than modern day US. So basically they had the emperor's seat, which was in Istanbul, which was Constantinople prior to that. And from there, they used to appoint different, governors in different areas. And those governors have almost full autonomy. And sometimes they even waged wars against each other. But at the end of the day, they had to pay the tax. So if they were able to collect the money and pay the tax to the emperor, they had full autonomy to do whatever they want. Once they failed to do so, either the empire would wage war against them, or they would send another stronger, let's say, governorate or city-state to attack that area. So it was fairly decentralized, and it gave the different people and different cultures a lot of leeway when it comes to how to live their lives and what to do, as long as they paid their taxes, you know? And that's
an
the only
age-old
tangent
tradition
that I
around the
wanted to
world.
mention.
Yeah. As long as you pay the
Yeah,
taxes, no one,
basically.
you can do whatever you want. I want to touch for a moment, one more time, on just the profile. And now I can throw in as a teaser that as a pairing with this podcast, we are working on a tasting. More details to come. Please follow and subscribe, and you will find those details. And we'll go more into detail in that tasting about the expressions that I've gotten to try and the expressions available in the US. Now, again, when you were in New York, the first place you went to was the Brandy Library. Love them. They host Scotch and Whiskey Society events. It's a very cool place to go. And you posted a video on Instagram of great writer and taster Robin Robinson at the Brandy Library, and he has a glass of Athyr in his hand, and among the other things that he talks about, the one that I wanted to ask about in particular was he's saying it's unusual to a Western palate. He's coming at it from the same angle I am of it's definitely a whiskey. You know it's whiskey, you know it's touched wood, you know it's has all those characteristics, it's grain based, but there are subtle differences. So when you were deciding to bring this product to the US, both product lines to the US, what was that thought process like in terms
Yes.
of, would we be ready for it with quote unquote Western palates, and what would need to be kind of put into that?
Okay. So the brands that I have are two different lines because we're trying to convey two different things with those brands. So Athyr, we're trying to reflect as much as possible the terroir, as I mentioned earlier. With Levant Heights, we're trying to experiment with different whiskey styles. So I'll first tackle the flavor profile of Athyr, sorry, and then go into Levant. So Athyr, we're using Quercus Libani, which is Lebanese oak, and also we're using the Lebanese barley, and we're using the amphora. So the Lebanese malted barley, because it's sun-dried, it retains a lot of its original cereal notes. So once it's fermented, the wash is fairly fruity, and that fruitiness translates through the still into both fruitiness and some interesting, I wouldn't say completely herbaceous. It's more like black tea notes as well. So there, you definitely have some yellow fruit notes in it and some black tea notes. But also the amphora adds an earthy character to it. Even its mouthfeel changes. It's quite rounded. Uh, so I'm sure if you remember from the tasting, they feel like they drink below proof.
Absolutely.
One
Yeah.
Definitely the distillation does play a part because we try to go for the longest head cut possible, but also because the amphora is quite the porous vessel and it's sealed with leather, so its cap is made of leather, so which is also a breathable membrane. most of the higher alcohols evaporate, producing a very mellow and creamy character. And on top of this, the Lebanese oak is a genus of its own, so it does have quite the unique flavor profile, which is honestly a bit less heavy on the vanilla versus, let's say, Quercus alba, which is American oak, but you
Mhm.
have more of those deep and dark, burnt sugar notes. So instead of like having a lot of vanilla in it, you might have a lot of butterscotch or maple syrup or even some molasses notes. So that that is for the Lebanese oak expression in particular. And when you add the cedarwood element to it, which is our double-aged expression of Athyr, the Athyr cedarwood, cedar is quite the oily and spicy wood. So this expression is what Robin had in his hand. That's
Mhm.
why he was describing it as uh, having some fats in it, because cedar has a lot of oils, and also it it has a very unique. It's not only unique to a Western palate; it's actually unique in general. Because imagine a whiskey that, especially with the cedarwood, that has a cured meat aftertaste. So, or the curing spices of a cured meat in its aftertaste, along with cigar box, tobacco leaf. It's quite interesting. It's very complex, and they're all nuanced. There's nothing really overpowering, especially when you add a drop of water to open up the aromas. So that's for Athir in particular, and definitely I think the American market is ready and is and wants flavor profiles that are quite unique. You don't only see this in spirits, but you also see this in the American cuisine. And the emergence of fusion cuisines, the evolution of the culinary arts in the US. I think the American consumer is always searching for new and interesting flavor profiles. So, on the other hand, we have Levant Heights, which is our craft and experimental whiskey, where we either take a whiskey style and we experiment with it, or we take the wash, a beer style, and experiment with it. So currently we have about five different expressions from Levant, two of which are available in the US. One of them is Irish inspired. So it's made, we try to experiment with the single pot still expression. I'm not going to go into too much details. I'll leave it as a teaser for when we actually do the tasting to go more into it. But we also experimented with the other expression that's available is called espresso roast dark malt. So we somewhat fermented stout, definitely no hops. So we only used dark malts. So the base malt is a Munich malt, and we also have some what do you call it? Some roasted malts as well, like heavy roast malt. So it's quite a toasty wash, which translates into a very toasty and nutty whiskey.
It was,
So
I mean, both of them in tasting both was the progression of the tasting, just for people listening, was the single pot still, the Levant Heights single pot still version, then the dark malts, and then the two Athyr expressions. And the it was definitely different for sure. The barley in itself, you just knew that there was something different there, whether it was the single pot still or the espresso roast. And I'll be honest, the dark malt took me a little bit longer to get used to, but I'm also someone who just doesn't like stouts. So I tend to stay. I like IPAs and pale ales and all that stuff. So I like bitter and light and piney, for beers at least. So, but I know a ton of people who would drink the dark malt and be like, "This is what I love in, as you're saying, in stouts and in dark beers. Like this is what I love in that, but in whiskey form." And it could be really exciting for people to try and to get into. And with I have to jump back to the barley, especially because the sun drying the barley is, I haven't heard of anyone else doing that. I'm sure there's someone, because there's always like one person somewhere doing something. But in terms of like sun drying the barley as opposed to kilning it or anything like that, what does that look like for you, and what does that mean for the barley?
Great. So sun drying the barley is actually the most ancient of techniques because it's technically the easiest of them.
Right.
You don't need a lot of resources. You just need the sun, you know? In Lebanon, we do have a culture of sun drying different things. So in our food, one of them is bulgur wheat. So basically, wheat is boiled and then it's cracked, and I think it's cracked, boiled, and then they sun dry it. So that's bulgur wheat. And there is also another kind of dried milk called kishik, where basically they do like a milk and starch paste, and then they sun dry it, and then they powderize it. Later on they rehydrate it and becomes into a soup, which is cooked with minced meat. So culturally, sun drying is there. Now, I have a small question for you. I know I don't like to put people under the spotlight, but do you know how old malted grains are? The history
I
of
mean,
malted grains.
oh, sorry. So I was saying I'm not sure about the malted part. I know the fermented, we've got evidence about 10,000 years back, but I don't know about the malted. I'm guessing about the same, but please tell me I'm wrong because I want to be corrected on this.
Believe it or not, malted grains didn't start for fermentation. People didn't malt grains in the beginning to do ales and beers. Someone discovered some 10,000 years ago by accident that if you malt uh, grains, they're easier to chew versus raw grains. And malting grains at the time was probably easier than cooking the grains because you malt them once and they're always available, so you can eat them whenever you want. So malts were originally a food source before they were used for fermentation. So if we're talking about 10,000 years, so I would say probably most likely it's going to be sun drying. It's not going to be anything else. Uh, and because it's the easiest method, that's why we chose it. I didn't have at the time an air kiln, and definitely we didn't. Well, I could have probably smoked them because also in our cuisine there is there's a certain kind of freaky food which is called freaky. So
Ah,
it's basically smoked durum wheat, which tastes like peated whiskey. You know, I could have went that direction, but definitely that was more, uh, accessible, and it came to mind first. The idea of uh, the idea of sun drying. It was easier, and the Mediterranean, on average, most Mediterranean countries get between 270 and 300 days of sunshine a year. So it was ideal to use the most available heat source, the sun.
Sure. And I'm thinking too about um I think I think this episode will have come out before for our episode. I spoke with Colby and Ashley Frey at Frey Ranch. It's a distillery in Nevada, excuse me. Um, and they have a peated or smoked malt, but because they the way that they did it was they kind of made a faux peat in that they took corn husks and compressed them down, fermented them, compressed them down until it resembled a peat brick, and use that to smoke the barley
Okay.
or the malts in general, I should say, not just the barley, but the grains. And I asked them that, and part of the way they did it was that it wasn't to. They wanted to make sure that they didn't heat the grains as they might in Scotland or Ireland in peating, or in Japan. They wanted to just have the smokiness and none of the heat, because they felt that the heat would damage the profile of the grains that they were trying to get. And it this made me think of it because in sun drying, correct me if I'm wrong, but in sun drying, the heat's not going to get to the same level as it would if you were kilning it or smoking it over wood or anything like that. So, um, is that accurate? Like the grains don't get as hot during the process.
Well, with pale malts, especially, it depends on how they're drying it. So they can be either air kilned or peated or smoked. So maybe with the peat smoke, they might reach higher temperatures, but certainly with the air drying, uh, I think it's more temperature controlled. So it really depends. Also, you can cold smoke something. You don't have, you
Sure.
can. So the further away you are from the heat source, the lower the temperature is. So, for example, the typical Isla uh, pagoda in a kiln is usually about 15 feet above the heat source. So, if you want less heat to reach the grains, you just raise the distance between the heat source and the grain. So, definitely with the sun, it's not gonna reach the same temperatures as, let's say, you can with air kilning or smoking, uh, peat kilning the grains. So, and mainly, definitely you might have higher diastatic power, because the diastatic power is basically when you have more enzymes that are retained from the malting process in order to convert the starch into simple fermentable sugars. So if you're not raising the temperature quite a bit, you can retain more of those enzymes. And definitely, you know, it might be, you might be retaining a lot of the, you know, cereal's original flavor profile. And also you might be altering it in a different way when you hit a certain temperature. So I don't know, honestly, I can't really give you a clear cut answer, but definitely the lower heat source has a better impact on the enzymes, and definitely you're not altering the malt as much versus when you heat it. Whether that is desirable or not, I think, in my opinion, it really depends on the type of grains that you are using.
Completely fair. I asked too, and we'll get more into this when we do that tasting that we teased. The flavor of the barley comes through, even in the more aged uh, expressions with the Athyr, even through the cedar. You know that it's a different type of barley, and I like that quite a bit. I just an episode just came out at the time of recording with Eimwerk. So yeah, in tasting at Park Avenue, it was very clear that the barley was different. That there was something new about the barley, and we'll get more into that when we do that tasting that we teased, which I'm really getting excited about now. And it also reminded me of a recent episode that just came out with Eimwerk Distillery in Iceland. And Icelandic barley, when it comes through in whiskey, is a powerhouse of flavor. It's just you. It's not. It's like no other barley you've tasted before. It's just smacks you in the face. So yeah, it was. I was just talking about the how your barley was very. It was singular in flavor. It tasted different than a commodity grain barley or something like that. It tasted more like in the way that Icelandic barley was super unique, and how Waterford is doing crazy things in Ireland with barley strains, just to the point that between the barley coming from Lebanon itself and your process, that the barley just comes out. And I can't wait for people to taste that.
So, are there any other distilleries in Lebanon that are producing whiskey? Not that I'm aware of. There is plenty of gin distilleries currently that are coming out. Uh, Definitely plenty of arak. There were, as I mentioned earlier, there are some whiskey bottlers that bottle imported entry-level Scotch whiskey. But I haven't been aware of any whiskey distillery yet. That might change sometime in the future. But to date, it's still just us.
All right. Well, with that, I will close out this interview. It looks like our computers are giving us a little challenge at the very end, but thankfully it was at the very end. So, Roy, thank you so much for coming on. I loved getting to taste these, meeting you in person. I'm going to really push this tasting because I'm excited for it. In the meantime, when this episode comes out, there will be links in the show notes to the website to where you can buy the expressions that are available in the US, to their social media. And
Thanks a lot, David.
absolutely, Roy, it was an absolute pleasure. Um, I will be in touch with you for more details on the tasting. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you everyone for listening to another episode of the Whiskering Podcast. I'll see you next time.
Thank you. See you.